All right, this is Racing Rundown, wherever you may be, however you may be listening, on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes. This is, once again, Racing Rundown. I have not been able to update this, so just a very quick update. If you have not seen the notifications already, Gary Stevens' interview has been pushed back until September. Uh, Also, Wednesday, we were supposed to have the president of Horse Racing Wrongs, Patrick Bottiello. He canceled on me. He got scared at the last minute. We're filling him in with Julie Crone on Wednesday. One guy who's not scared, though, is Jay Privman, Daily Racing Forum correspondent and the original friend of the show. Jay, how you doing today?
Good, Jack. How are you?
So I guess we should start with the age-old question whenever I bring someone on. How'd you get started in this game of horse racing?
Well, it's as a fan, I got interested in it at a young age. My dad would go to the track with his buddies about once a month, and it became a sport that I followed along with baseball and football and basketball and hockey. I remember watching the Kentucky Derby for the first time when I was 9 years old. Um, and then I grew up in the Los Angeles area, and we went on a family vacation to San Diego when I was 11. And one of the things that we did on that trip was go to Del Mar, which I wanted to do. And I just loved the whole atmosphere. And I was always really good in math in school, and the challenge of trying to figure out winners and all the things that you need to incorporate into handicapping really appealed to me. And so that was sort of the genesis of my original interest, and I've followed it closely since pretty much I was 11 years old, which was only 4 years ago, but still.
What would you say was your favorite memory in your early days in the sport?
Um, Depends on how early back you'd go. In terms of watching races on television, I wouldn't necessarily say this it was a favorite memory of mine, but I obviously distinctly remember Secretariat winning the Triple Crown. But I was 13 years old at the time that happened, and I was a huge fan of Sham. So I actually was a Secretariat hater at the time because I was just a kid who was a fanboy of Sham. And it wasn't really until later, when I maybe in my late teens or early 20s, when I really could fully appreciate what Secretariat had accomplished. But I have a distinct memory of that. I would say one of my favorite early memories before I worked professionally in covering the sport was seeing Affirmed run in California, especially he won the Hollywood Gold Cup as a 4-year-old carrying 132 pounds, and that was before I worked professionally as a reporter covering racing. So that would be one of the earlier memories.
And you got to hear the voice of the late great Harry Hooper in that Hollywood Gold Cup. Uh, that's kind of funny that you mentioned you were a Secretariat hater. Last year, the 3 times I tried to pick against Justify, and I got beat all 3 times, and I looked like an idiot all 3 times. And I'm now laughing at it because if we go another long stretch without a Triple Crown, I'm going to be like, well, I didn't enjoy the Triple Crown that we did have early. But, like I said to you at Belmont Park, and I don't think this made it on camera, but just an aside, Larry Colmus needs to not retire for a long time because the way that NYRA announcers work is that one guy gets all the Triple Crown winners, then 2 of them don't get any, and then it cycles, every third guy gets them.
No, I hope Larry's doing it for a long time. He's a terrific race caller and an even better person.
Yeah, Larry's a great guy. When did you first think that, you mentioned that you were into all kinds of other sports. When did you think that, or decide that thoroughbred racing was the sport that you wanted to cover professionally?
When I was working part-time at a paper called the LA Daily News, when I was still in college, they didn't really have anybody who regularly covered the big races. And the entry-level job when you're starting out in the newspaper business at that time was covering high school football games on Friday nights. So that was what I did for that paper. And then there were several of us who were all like 19 or 20 years old who they hired to work part-time or more in the office. And the year that Spectacular Bid came to California to begin his 4-year-old year, following his terrific 3-year-old season, but he came to California to run as a 4-year-old. his first race was in the Malibu Stakes, and they didn't have anybody at the paper to regularly cover racing, and so I sort of raised my hand and said, "Can I please do it?" And they let me do it, and it was from that I started covering racing more often. And I always wanted to cover racing. I just didn't think I was going to get that good of an opportunity that early on in my professional career. And a little more than a year later, when I was graduating from college, they had made me full time. So it all kind of came together quickly, but it was very much a right place, right time, opportunistic situation. I mean, if the same opportunity had happened covering hockey or baseball, my career might have gone in a completely different direction.
You covered your first Kentucky Derby in 1982. What's that like to go to the Kentucky Derby for the first time?
It was a great thrill because I had watched it on TV for a number of years, but to actually be there and to not really know where I was going in terms of driving to the track. I remember the first morning coming around a corner and all of a sudden seeing the Twin Spires, and I was like, "Oh my God, there they are!" And that was before they had built up the grandstand and the clubhouse on either side of the Twin Spires. Back then, they really stood out because they were the tallest part of the roof of the facility back then, and so they really would pop and stand out on the horizon. And so that was just a great thrill to be there. And as it turned out, the winner of that Derby was Gato del Sol, who was a California-based horse. Eddie Delahousse rode him. Eddie Gregson was his trainer. They were California-based. And so for someone who was covering their first Derby for the first time and really was a greenhorn and didn't really know his way around the stable area there or where things were, it made it a lot easier to have some familiar faces winning the race and being able to write about them. And that was a pretty fortunate situation. But it was a great thrill just to be there and to have been at every one since now.
Now, in 1984, or 1982 actually, but 1984 was when it actually first happened, John Gaines came up with this idea for something called the Breeders' Cup, a 7-race card with $10 million in total purses, and it was to be run the first time in 1984 at Hollywood Park. What were your impressions about the Breeders' Cup going into that inaugural running and being there for the first time? Did you think it was going to be a long-term successful thing, or just this is something that tries and fizzles out after like 5 years or so?
No, I was hopeful that it was going to work. It seemed like a good idea because it was going to bring together all the top divisional contenders for Eclipse Awards and actually have a definitive spot for them all to meet, as opposed to it being a little more of a hodgepodge situation that it was prior to that. But still, it was a leap of faith as to how it would go. And I just remember that first Breeders' Cup. It was an incredibly exciting day because you had just one terrific race after another with all of these terrific horses and horses that had come in from Europe to run. It was it was as good as you could imagine in terms of the quality of the horses that were running, and to see 7 races of that caliber, one after the other, was something that I had never experienced before. I don't know that anybody in the United States had ever experienced anything remotely like that before. And it was an incredibly exciting day. And there was a lot of drama. There was a disqualification in the juvenile fillies race. There was an exciting stretch run with a lot of bumping in the Classic. So it was just a terrific day of racing all around. It was really a memorable afternoon.
What would you say were some of the standout moments in the first decade, the early days of the Breeders' Cup?
Well, the very first Breeders' Cup, to see horses that had been largely performing back east have to come to California and race was really exciting, because a lot of those horses, like a horse like Slew of Gold, for instance, who came out for that inaugural Breeders' Cup, I don't know that he would have come to California to race had it not been for the Breeders' Cup. So those kinds of situations early on were some of the things that really I found to be some of the most exciting aspects of the Breeders' Cup early on. But in terms of like which which races stand out or things like that. One of the great memories for me was in the very second running of the Breeders' Cup, which was at Aqueduct, and the only time it's been run at Aqueduct. One of my favorite horses of all time was a horse named Precisionist, who had won the Stroop Series earlier that year at Santa Anita, and then needed time off during the summer. And even though he had largely run it a mile and a quarter, he was a brilliant horse from 7 furlongs to a mile and a quarter in the Stroop Series that year. But he came off a freshening and off a 4.5-month layoff ran in the Breeders' Cup Sprint and won. And he had trained like an absolute freak going into that race, and to see him perform like that against world-class sprinters off a 4.5-month layoff and beat those horses, I thought was one of the great performances in the early runnings of the Breeders' Cup. And then the very next year at Santa Anita, I thought the ride Lafitte Pinkai gave Skywalker in the Classic, where he kind of trapped Precisionist and made him uncomfortable early on, running alongside of him, and still had enough left to hold off the late runners, was one of the great rides that I've seen, especially early on in the running of the Breeders' Cup. So those would be from the first few years. Those were some of the things that kind of stood out for me.
I'm just going to add a note about Lafitte Pinkai there. Lafitte Pinkai also handed Lady Secret Horse of the Year in that race. Either the two horses in that race, Precisionist, who, by the way, was ridden by Gary Stevens, just a note to throw in. Gary very early had poor luck in the Breeders' Cup Classic, but Precisionist and Turkoman, either horse wins that race, they're Horse of the Year. They both lose. Lady Secret handed Horse of the Year that day. What was it like to see Lady Secret race that day? I know Woody Stevens called her the best filly he's ever raced. Whether or not you believe that, Lady Secret was definitely one sensational horse. What was your impression of her?
Yeah, I don't remember Woody Stevens saying that. I mean, Wayne Lucas trained her, and Pat Day rode her. I'm sure he had great respect for her. The thing that was great about Lady Secret was they called her the Iron Filly, because she just kept coming every 2-3 weeks and running against males quite often and beating them. I mean, she was an incredibly talented mare, and even though, like you say, she might have backed into Horse of the Year, her overall body of work that year was sensational. She had a number of top-class races, and she raced often, which is something that I, as an Eclipse Award voter, like to see. I think horses should be rewarded for performing and performing often, and she certainly did that year.
Now, you had also been covering the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown. In those early 90s Triple Crowns, what were some of the better horses that you had seen run?
Well, I mean, probably the best rivalry I've seen was in '89 with Sunday Silence and Easy Goer, both of whom were world-class horses. And had great respect for both horses, and then the gentleman who trained them, Charlie Whittingham with Sunday Silence, and Shug McGahee with Easy Goer. And either of those horses could have been Triple Crown winners had the other horse not been born the same year. They were both sensational racehorses, so that was probably my favorite. Rivalry to have covered, and of the early Triple Crowns that I covered, that stands out. The other thing that stood out early on for me would have been in '86 when Bill Shoemaker won the Kentucky Derby with Ferdinand and became the oldest jockey ever to win the Kentucky Derby at age 54, with just a great ride on Ferdinand. And to see him pretty much cap his career with a win like that was pretty spectacular and a great moment.
Now, in 1998, you got a chance to take an employment opportunity with the Daily Racing Forum, where you've been for ever since then. What was your mindset going into working for the Daily Racing Forum, organization that is one of the most, I don't know if this would be the correct word for it, but I guess one of the most iconic horse racing media platforms?
Well, I'd obviously read and used the Daily Racing Forum since I was a child, so I had quite a bit of fondness for it. But that summer, a group of people took ownership of the Racing Forum, namely Stephen Christ, who had previously been with the New York Times and that had founded the publication called the Racing Times in the early 90s for which I had worked. And he and a gentleman named Charlie Hayward put together a group to buy Daily Racing Form. And I have great respect for both those guys. I liked the vision that they had for what they wanted the paper to be, and the position that they offered me to be the lead national news writer, titles national correspondent, but basically to be the lead writer for the Triple Crown lead up and the Derby and the Breeders' Cup coverage and things of that nature was extremely appealing. And so it was an easy decision to make, both because of the position and who I was going to be associated with.
Now, I remember talking to you in the past about some of the early, the Triple Crowns you got to cover in the early 2000s. Of those three, the War Emblem, Funny Side, and Smarty Jones bids, what was it like to be there on Belmont Stakes Day all three times and see those horses get denied in completely different, not necessarily completely different ways, but in ways that kind of had separate, they lost the race in separate ways, I guess you could say that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, War Emblem lost the race first stride out of the gate when he went to his face and stumbled. The Smarty Jones race was the one that, to me, was the most surprising, because I really thought he was going to win the Triple Crown going into that year's Belmont Stakes. He just looked like he was far and away the better than his competition that year, and he only got run down in the final yards of that Belmont Stakes. But the thing I remember most, Jack, about that Belmont is that the roar coming off the turn was deafening, and I've never heard a place with that many people get so quiet when the race ended, because they were all there to hopefully see a Triple Crown, which hadn't happened since Affirmed, and it looked like turning into the stretch he was going to pull it off, and then he just got tired and Birdstone ran him down, and it just became awfully quiet there for the 100,000 plus people that were there that day. It went from just this deafening roar to library-like in about 25 seconds.
Now, ESPN eventually bought out NBC for a couple of horse racing events. They bought them out for the Belmont Stakes from 2006 to 2010 and the Breeders' Cup from 2006 to 2011. Now, being a Breeders' Cup man, what was it like when you found out you were going to have the opportunity to be able to be down on trackside and be able to interview some of the winning trainers of Breeders' Cup races?
Well, those have been great experiences for me. I like reporting. I like being able to interview people, and I think that's my strongest skill set. And the one that stands out of all of those for the Breeders' Cup has to be when Zenyatta won the Classic at Santa Anita, because my assignment that day was to just basically shadow John Sheriffs and to interview him when the race was over. And so I took up a position with my camera person. We were about 100 feet or so from John Sheriffs, to where we were keeping an eye on him, but not in the camera shot, so that if she won, the camera could focus on John Sheriffs without me getting in the way. But then not long after that, I could move in and interview him. And as you remember, she came with a big rush and won the race, and it was in front of her home crowd, and the place went bananas. And so I jumped in and interviewed John, and we were walking down the racetrack, and at one point he always wears a baseball cap on his head, and he threw his cap into the crowd. It was just a really joyous moment, and the thing that made it the most special was that she had pulled off that win in front of the fans that adored her the most at Santa Anita. And so it was just a great moment, and that's probably one of the greatest situations I've ever been involved in as a reporter, was that specific Breeders' Cup Classic with Zenyatta and having to interview John after the race.
Now, I want to ask you about one of the more loaded Breeders' Cup Classic fields that there's been in recent memory, and I'm going to go back to 2007, so rewind a couple of years. That race brought the Clash of Titans, that I think, to date, the deepest three-year-old class that there's been, with Curlin, Hardspun, and Street Sense, the big three. And then it also brought back Any Given Saturday, who was a horse that is forgotten in the shadow of those big three, but Any Given Saturday had a lot of talent. And then there was also Lawyer Ron. What was that Breeders' Cup Classic like, going into that with such a quality field?
Well, obviously the quality of the field, like you point out, was sensational because you had the Derby winner and the Preakness winner and a horse who had lost the Belmont by a nose in that race. Curlin being descriptive of the latter two, and obviously Street Sense being the Derby winner that year. And it was just a high quality field. And the thing that was just so disappointing about that was the weather. Unfortunately, that weekend at Monmouth Park was just a deluge. It was the one time the races have been at Monmouth. I really think they deserve to have another Breeders' Cup, and unfortunately, the one time that it was there, just for bad luck, they had the just awful weather. I remember the Sunday; it was absolutely beautiful there. So that took a little bit of the starch out of that weekend, but I don't think it detracted from the performance that we saw from Curlin that day. He was brilliant, as he was throughout his career, and why he ended up in the Hall of Fame with all that he accomplished. But that, to me, was he ran a lot of very good races, and that ranks right up there with one of his best.
Now, I want to ask you a question as a person who is a Breeders' Cup man. You've written a book about it. I'll talk about that in a second. But about the rotation of where the Breeders' Cup goes, a lot of people have long been speculating that the Breeders' Cup might get a permanent location or might just cycle between Santa Anita and Kentucky. Of all the places that the Breeders' Cup has been, would you like to see it go back to not necessarily what it was originally intended to be, but cycle through more tracks? Obviously, some of them not 100% possible with reconstructions and everything, but would you like to see the Breeders' Cup hit more venues besides just California and Kentucky?
Yeah, I think the spirit of the Breeders' Cup was for it to rotate. I know there have been, over the years, a faction of people on various Breeders' Cup boards who have thought that maybe a permanent home would be in the best interest of the Breeders' Cup. But I really think the most fair way to do it is for it to move around. I think you would end up disenfranchising a certain segment of the racing community if it was always in one spot and people always were having to ship. I think it's more fair for it to be in different places, different years, and for 1 year the Kentucky horses to maybe have the home field advantage, and maybe the next year the California horses. But to your specific question, Jack, I would like to see it go to a few more places. Most notably Belmont Park. They haven't had the Breeders' Cup in a long time, and I just think the Breeders' Cup should be in New York on occasion, and I'm hoping that in time that Belmont Park gets back into some sort of a rotation.
Do you think in the future the Breeders' Cup would ever see it go back to places like Woodbine or Arlington or Gulfstream?
I don't see that in the current makeup of things. There have been changes at those tracks that might not allow them to have the Breeders' Cup in the future. I enjoyed the Breeders' Cup experiences at those places, but either because of track surface differences or reconfiguration of the circumference of the ovals, they've just or facility wise in terms of the footprint and what kind of crowd you can handle, I think those things have made those places less desirable than some of the other options that the Breeders' Cup has at the moment.
Now, you mentioned a couple minutes ago that you were an Eclipse Award voter. What would you say were some of the hardest decisions that you've had to make in recent memory with Eclipse Awards?
Wow, I'd have to go through. I'd have to go through my ballots and kind of look at them. That's a tough one, really. Off the top of my head, to be honest with you. I'd have to grab some of my stuff here in a file to think about what's been a tough call. Most of the time for me, it's it's more people related than it is horse related. I think a lot of the times the the winners of each division kind of stand out. But one of the things that I like to do when it comes to voting for the people is looking at who I voted for each individual category in terms of the connections of each horse, and then if I find some commonality, perhaps vote for the jockey or trainer who had multiple champions on my ballot. So, for instance, just this last year, I voted for Joel Rosario for champion jockey because on my ballot I had Game Winner as 2-year-old male and Jaywalk for 2-year-old female and Accelerate for older male on dirt, all of whom Joel Rosario rode, and that to me was a better mark or overall record than some of the other options like Jose Ortiz or Gerard Ortiz, both of whom had great years, and I'm not knocking Gerard Ortiz winning because he certainly had a champion caliber year. I just thought that in the way I like to look at it, I thought Rosario was a more deserving winner just based on what the horses that he rode had accomplished at year's end.
Now, finally, in 2014, the Triple Crown drought began to waver a little bit, and California Chrome started that. Ultimately, he did lose that Belmont Stakes, but out in California, there was a bay colt that was catching a lot of eyes, American Pharoah. He actually lost his maiden race at Del Mar by a significant margin, but he came back and he won the Del Mar Futurity and the Front Runner Stakes handily. When did you first realize that American Pharoah was something more than just the average really good 2-year-old?
Well, I know they were very high on him before he ever ran, and so his first race was pretty disappointing, and I have a distinct memory of his last work before the Del Mar Futurity, watching that work, and he worked brilliantly, and they were like, well, we thought highly of this horse, and here he is working great. We're going to throw him in the Del Mar Futurity because we think he's good enough. And he won that race, and then went on from there. And then the next year won swept the Triple Crown. But when did I think he was a cut above? As a 2-year-old, he was obviously very good. But there've been so many horses over the years that looked like they were going to win the Triple Crown, and I think a lot of times people would get ahead of themselves and see a horse win a race in February and be like, oh, he could win the Triple Crown. It's like, let him win the Derby first. Let's slow down here just a little bit. But when he won, gutted out the Derby when it probably wasn't at his best that day, that was a pretty gutty performance on his part. And then he came back and won the Preakness so easily that by the time they got to the Belmont, I had seen over the years so many horses show up going for the Triple Crown and look like they were headed the wrong way physically. Most notably Big Brown, it just didn't look right that week. By contrast, American Pharoah just looked fantastic. He had held his coat. His last work coming into the race was as good as you could work, and I had no doubt that he was going to run his race and win on the day. So I can't say that back in February of that year I thought he's going to win the Triple Crown, but I thought very highly of him all along, and I just sort of let it unfold as it did that spring, because I've never been one to want to try and predict in February who's going to win the Derby, let alone say, oh, this horse could win the Triple Crown. I just don't like to play that game. But he was just an incredibly talented horse. I've never seen a horse that moved as gracefully as he did. It was just such effortless motion to cover so much ground so quickly, and that's, I think, what made him as special as he was as a racehorse.
Do you have a moment from that Belmont Stakes? I know Paul LaDuca has said before that when American Pharoah came into the stretch, he turned away from the race, and he said that I turned away from that because I knew I was going to see it a million more times, and I wanted to look and see what the crowd's reaction was when American Pharoah pulled off the Triple Crown. Do you have anything from that Belmont Stakes day that sticks out to you in your memory?
No, I watched the race from the press box, and I just remember as they got to the top of the stretch, thinking, boy, he's going to pull it off. I mean, you could see he was going well within himself, and at the top of the stretch, he turned back a bit from Frosted, and there was really nobody who was making a run at him. And it was like, wow, it's finally going to happen. And so for someone who had been watching races on TV since they were 9 years old and covering Triple Crown races, every Kentucky Derby since 1982, and seeing all the bids that came up short over the years, including the one you just mentioned, California Chrome, to see a horse finally pull it off was just a really satisfying thing to do. And the thing that I really thought of, like immediately when it was over, was, thank God the Triple Crown hasn't been tweaked in terms of how many weeks between races or the distances or some of the things that people have suggested doing over the years as the drought went on. Because if it had been, we never would have known if American Pharoah would have pulled it off under the old system. But fortunately, it wasn't changed, and we know that he could pull it off under the old system. And what we've seen from him and Justify is that it just takes a spectacular kind of horse as opposed to having to gimmick things up for them. And it makes it more satisfying when those horses come along, and I think people appreciate it more. The thing I remember about American Pharoah, not only about thinking as they turn to the stretch, wow, he's going to pull it off, but then when they hit the wire, just the crowd reaction was just so great. It just lasted for so long, the roar as he galloped out and came back to be unsaddled. And one of the things that I really thought was classy of Victor Espinoza to do that day was to take American Pharoah way up the stretch, all the way to about the 8th pole, for a curtain call so that the fans could see him after the race and cheer for him and get another look at him before he went to the winner's circle. I thought that was a really classy thing on his part to do, and but that was one of the things that I really remember most vividly from that afternoon.
Now, I did mention before when I was talking about how I have addressed the opponents of this sport. What do you think horse racing can do to not necessarily just improve its image, but promote the sport and get more people interested in horse racing?
I mean, that's something that would take up another entire podcast. But I think racing needs to stop apologizing for what it is. There are people in this sport who care deeply about the horses, and I think to allow people who don't care about the sport and want to see its demise is a foolish avenue to go down. And I'm hoping that the sport and people in the sport can be more forthright and speak more strongly to that, and not be cowed into doing things that are probably not in the best interest of the sport long term.
He's Jay Privman. In addition to being a correspondent for the Daily Racing Forum, he's also written a book about the Breeders' Cup, Thoroughbred Racing Championship Day. Wrote that in 2004 by Bill Shoemaker. So if there's any more reason to get that, seeing a forward from one of the greatest jockeys in the history of all of horse racing, not even just in this country, but in horse racing in general. The last question I'm going to ask you, Jay, is, and I ask all my guests this, is if you could go back in time to one moment and be there to witness it firsthand, I give you a time machine and you can go back in time and be there firsthand to witness it. Like, for example, Chantel gave me on Friday, she says she would want to go back and see Ruffian run in her heyday. What moment would you go back and see?
I'd love to see Secretariat's Belmont in person. I mean, that still stands out as like the greatest single performance ever. And I think now that I'm a little bit older and wiser and not 13 years old and standing in the on-deck circle of my senior league baseball game when a friend of mine came up to the backstop and yelled, "Hey, Jay, Secretariat just won the Triple Crown." And I turned around and said, "Big deal," because I was so mad that he had beaten Sham. I think I would really have a great appreciation for that now, and would love to see that. So I would pick that, I think, as the moment I'd like to go back in time and have a do-over on.
Yeah, like I could have a do-over on Justify. If you want to sign up for Daily Racing Forum premium, you could get some of Jay's articles. You know, I have told the story before about how I tried to do a Kentucky Derby jockey prediction episode, and it went horribly because I predicted everything. I uploaded the episode, and I had not checked Twitter, and Jay Privman, who's the Woj of horse racing, was dropping J-bombs and saying everything happened, so naturally everything I had said was completely overshadowed by everything. So highly recommend subscribing to the Daily Racing Forum. Not sponsored by that or anything, it's just a casual observer saying a great media format. Jay, thank you for your time.
Oh, my pleasure, Jack. Thanks for having me on.